Welcome to the League of Women Voters meeting. We are delighted to have Dan McCool, Professor Emeritus in the Political Science Department at the University of Utah. Dan, maybe you can mention some of your interests and research areas, and then the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Jill. And I'm so appreciative of what all of you are doing in terms of trying to get out the vote. Every election is about turnout. So it's really critical. And I study two completely different fields. They're actually somewhat related. One of them is water policy in the Colorado River Basin and the American West, but the other one is voting rights. So I spend a lot of time looking at the voting rights of minorities and especially Native Americans. One of the reasons why Native Americans didn't have any water rights in the Colorado River Basin in the 1922 compact was because they couldn't vote. If you look at who votes, who shows up, those are the people who get the water all over the country. They're actually absolutely related. The people who get what they want are the people who turn out and vote. So the work you're doing is critically important. I'm going to talk a little bit about Lake Powell today. I think you want me to focus on Lake Powell, but we can't really understand what's happening at Lake Powell unless we look at the whole Colorado River system. And what happened, I'm going to take a literature that could fill this entire room and boil it down to about a 5-minute presentation here to give you the context. But the 1922 compact divvied up the water among the 7 basin states, and it was fundamentally flawed in several important ways. One of them, it divvied up the water in fixed amounts rather than percentages, which is a great solution if the river ran exactly the same amount every year. And obviously it doesn't. And in fact, it's changed dramatically. So that era has just compounded all the problems in the river basin. The second problem is that they completely left out Native American water rights. In fact, the compact and all the subsequent legislation through the years has either ignored Native Americans or minimized any kind of reference to them or trivialized them or insulted them, but it's never allocated. None of the legislation has ever allocated any water to the 30 tribes in the Colorado River Basin. The only reason why they have water rights is because they've won water rights in the courts. And today they are big time players. They have rights to a little over 20 million acre feet, 20% of the acre feet. The acre feet's the standard of volume used to measure water. And they still have possibly another 10 or 20% of river flow that hasn't been established yet through either litigation or multiple settlements. And the last problem they made with the 22 compact is they artificially divvied up the river at Lee Ferry. But of course, there's no such thing as an upper Colorado River Basin and a lower Colorado River Basin. There's only one basin. And thinking of them holistically, systemically makes so much more sense than trying to divide it into 2 basins, which of course are ultimately at odds with each other and will be fighting with each other. And I think that's going to happen. So you take that, the compact and all this litigation and all this legislation that I've talking about is collectively known as the law of the river. The law of the river determines who gets what water in the river. And it has not adequately reflected changes due to climate change. The river has declined in flow about 20% just since 2020. We're in a 22-year drought. We should not even think about this as a drought. The word drought is hopelessly inappropriate and inadequate. This is climate change induced aridification. All the projections are that the flow of the Colorado River will never come back to what it was before. And in fact, it may decline by yet another 20%. That's staggering. So in 1922, they made the erroneous assumption, and there's some evidence that indicates they knew they were making an erroneous assumption, that the river might have 18 million acre feet. So they divvied up the water very liberally to different parties, except for Indians. Of course, it's easier to reach an agreement when you can hand out more water goodies, right? But the water's not there. And now with climate change, the water really isn't there. And you put that all together, and what does that mean? That means that today, Lake Powell is at 24% of full pool, 24%. And you look at the elevation of Lake Powell. Here's the important thing to understand. It's still significantly, still quite a few feet above the point where it no longer produces hydropower. But here's the thing. The reservoir is shaped kind of like a wine glass, like this. And the top part's gone. So what you have left is the stem, like this. So a 10% reduction in inflow means a huge drop in the level of the lake. Does everybody follow that? If you have a 10% reduction up here, it only drops a few feet. So could the Colorado River drop, say, 60 feet in just a few months down when it's down in the stem? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And it's to the point where that could absolutely happen. And it will no longer produce hydropower. And the problem is the outlets for the inlets where the water goes in to the penstocks, and the penstocks run through the dam and then operate a turbine, a spinning turbine to produce hydropower. The lake level is so low that it's hovering near the inlets of the penstocks. There's about it depends on who you talk to, maybe a 30% probability that hydropower could end in the next year or two. I actually think it could be higher than that, but they're taking draconian efforts to prevent that. Below the level of the penstocks, there are outlets called the bypass tubes. The lake level from the penstocks to the bypass tubes is not very different. So if it drops to where the penstocks no longer have water, it's not too far until it drops to the point where the bypass tubes are out of the water. When that happens, the lake reaches what's called dead pool. Dead pool is there's no way to pass water in a controlled fashion through the dam. So that would mean that the only water going through Glen Canyon Dam is whatever inflow there is in the main stem and the tributaries. We'd have no control over it. Well, that would have devastating consequences for the Grand Canyon. And of course, incredible consequences for Lake Mead and hydropower at Lake Mead and all the dominoes, the other 7 dams downriver. So the dams are lined up like dominoes, and just like in the game of dominoes, when one of them has a collapse situation, it collapses subsequent dams downriver. So what are we going to do about this situation? Well, the Bureau of Reclamation they just declared what's called a Tier 2 shortage, which is river talk for the lower basin states having to make draconian cuts. California has already made significant cuts. So for this round, it's going to be very dramatic water supply cuts in Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico has agreed that Mexico gets 1 million acre feet from the river, according to the 1944 treaty with Mexico. They've agreed to cuts in exchange for money. And we may think, oh, great, Mexico took the hit. That's wonderful. Well, a lot of our fruits and vegetables that we eat in the wintertime are grown with Colorado River water in Mexico. So that doesn't just affect Mexico, it affects us. A lot of the really healthy food that we all like to eat, well, that's on the line now. So dramatic cuts downstream in the lower basin. The Secretary for Water and Science just announced that she expected dramatic cuts throughout the Colorado River Basin, including the upper basin. And basically the upper basin thumbed their nose at the Assistant Secretary and said, no, you can't make us do that. We're not going to do that. We'll think about it, but we don't have to do anything like that. Utah just sort of said, yeah, whatever, that's not our problem. Of course, it truly is our problem. So that didn't really work. The other thing that the Bureau of Reclamation is doing is it's sacrificing upstream reservoirs in a desperate effort to save hydropower production at Lake Powell. So they're basically draining Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo, 3 upstream reservoirs, all of which, by the way, produce hydropower. So if they drain those to save hydropower at Lake Powell, then they've sacrificed hydropower at other dams. You can kind of get a sense of these are desperate measures, and they're stopgaps, they're short-term. You can only drain upstream reservoirs until they're dry, right? And Flaming Gorge is still in pretty good shape. Navajo in modest shape. Blue Mesa's basically, it's in really bad shape. So that's only going to work for a short time. If you love Lake Powell, the only way to save Lake Powell is to sacrifice agriculture in the upper basin. That's it. That's the only way. And most of that is hay production. If you eat beef, then that will directly affect you. Although it's true, we export a great deal of the hay. So it's actually not feeding us. It's just an export crop, primarily to Japan, China, and Saudi Arabia, where they feed it to horses and cattle. But that's the only viable solution to saving Lake Powell. The other option. And this is what I advocate. And let me stress that my view on this is quite different than the river managers and most of the bureaucratic structure in the Colorado River Basin. They still feel that these incremental changes will work. They still believe the 1922 Colorado River Compact is the foundational document and should remain so. In my view, the 22 Compact is the problem. It's an albatross. It's an overtly racist document. It did not envision the West that we have today. It cannot possibly serve our needs. And we need to restructure in a fundamental way the law of the river. The law of the river worked great when there was a surplus of water. It does not work at all when there's a scarcity of water. And we have a scarcity of water that's absolutely unprecedented. So what we have is a bunch of bureaucracies making incremental changes in a period of time of non-incremental changes in river flow and climate. You know, what could possibly go wrong with that scenario, right? Well, we're seeing it right here. So one of the radical proposals was to drill new bypass tubes around Lake Powell. When you suggested that to people in the basin, the managers 5 years ago, they would say, you're insane, you're crazy, you're a radical environmental lunatic. The Bureau of Reclamation is now studying that option. They just got $4 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act to work on systemic issues in the Colorado River Basin as a whole. One of the things they're going to look at is drilling bypasses around Lake Powell so that we can actually control releases once it reaches dead pool. And keep in mind, even at dead pool, the reservoir is still something like, oh, I forgot now, 60 miles long, maybe 70. So even at dead pool, there's still a very large reservoir there. But at dead pool, we have no control over releases. So if it didn't rain and there was virtually no inflow, which under the current climate scenario, that this can happen for weeks at a time, the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon would essentially be dry, go down to a trickle. It would become a small stream. That, of course, is problematic for everything from the recreation industry there. It's a national park. There are endangered species and endangered species protection programs in the canyon. So that's a worst case scenario that is staring us in the face right now. So something really has to change. And I think the most important change from my perspective, and again, this absolutely does not reflect the view of Colorado River managers, but I think we need to start thinking about the decline and eventual disappearance of Lake Powell, not as a loss, but as a gain. We have to see the bright side. The bright side is we get Glen Canyon back. We just spent a week down on Lake Powell, and our focus was not speedboating or skiing. And I understand people who love that, and I can see how attractive that is. Our purpose was to tour all the side canyons. There's roughly 100 side canyons in Glen Canyon that have come back to life. And it was amazing. When the water level declines, within a matter of years, They are beautiful, they are fecund, they're green, it's lush. There's native vegetation coming back. All that sediment load that's been building up down there is loaded with natural seeds and everything from willows to cottonwoods. And it all just comes back to life. It's beautiful. And we're not the only people doing that. The Glen Canyon National Recreation Area manager has stated that he thinks a significant portion of the visitation to Lake Powell today is not to see Lake Powell, but it's to see Glen Canyon. That's the change that's taking place. And I've sort of concocted a phrase for the land that's come out. I call it the emergent landscape. And we see emergent landscapes all over the West as multiple, literally hundreds of reservoirs are declining. And there is no law or policy for managing emergent landscapes. In the case of Lake Powell, the emergent landscape is tens of thousands of acres. It's enormous. And there is no land management policy. There's no water management policy. There's no access policy. Do we need to permit that? Should we build trails in that? How do we manage it? There's all kinds of questions of the return of flora and fauna in the emergent landscape. We need to look at sedimentation. There's a huge amount of sediment that has settled, especially in the upper portions of the reservoir. How's that going to move? Does it create problems? All of that settlement is eventually going to end up at the base of the dam. So eventually, not only is the top of the reservoir going down with climate change, the bottom is coming up because there's so much sediment. So Lake Powell is being squeezed from both the top and the bottom. So people say, let's save Lake Powell. That's pretty much impossible. I understand there are many people that love Lake Powell. It's much better to think of it as probably a mistake. It is a beautiful reservoir, possibly the most beautiful reservoir in the world. That's because it didn't flood all of Glen Canyon. The part that was still out of the water is absolutely gorgeous. And as the water declines, that gorgeous landscape is coming out in very dramatic and beautiful ways. So what are we going to do with Lake Powell? I think the question is, what are we going to do with Glen Canyon? I'm not timing myself. Is that about a half hour? Or am I good? Or I can't, I think you're muted.
You've got about 8 or 9 minutes. You're good to go.
Okay. So if we take this concept of emergent landscape, in many cases, it's a good thing, right? We're literally getting land back. Okay. Think about that. When's the last time we got land back? And when the continents were formed, I don't know, last time, that's a new problem. We don't have any policies or anything for that. In some places, the emergent landscape is a real problem, like the Great Salt Lake. We don't want an emergent landscape in the Great Salt Lake. That'll do us all in here on the Wasatch Front. That's another absolute huge disaster in the making. In the case of Lake Powell and some other reservoirs, it's a plus. And what that means is that we'll consolidate water storage in some reservoirs and abandon other reservoirs because there's not enough water now to fill all of them. So that means dam removal. That means dam removal and restoration. And there's been about 1,000 dam removals in America. There's 80,000 dams in America over 25 feet in height. So 1,000 may sound like a lot, but you take out 1,000 today, there'd be 79,000 dams left. So in some places like the Klamath River was once a beautiful river with a huge salmon run. They're taking out 4 dams on the Klamath River, and the river's in dire straits. The salmon are dying. We're going to see a massive restoration effort. So we need to learn from the Klamath and other removal efforts, dam removal efforts, on how the science of that, how we manage it, how we manage sediment access, revegetation, reintroducing native fish. We're going to face all of those questions in the Colorado River Basin. We really need, I feel like I'm blowing my own horn here. What we need is more scientists and more people studying the Colorado River and water policy, because it's a whole new ballgame. We are at a fundamental turning point, and we need the best science possible on everything from flows to biology to sediment to recreation to management. How do we collaboratively manage a river in decline? That's very different from how we manage a river in stasis. That's basically the same every year. And it's very different from how we manage a river that has a surplus, where when there's a conflict, this is how we manage the Colorado River for the first 100 years. Somebody get upset, somebody didn't get enough, they form a political group and they demand more, and we give them more. So it was the politics of distributive goodies, right? We just hand out more goodies. That works great when there's plenty of goodies. But guess what? The goodies have run out. And actually, the goodies are declining. We're going to have to get along without handing out goodies. And the traditional strategy that's being looked at, as always, is not to make people live within their water budgets, not to ask people to, or cities or states, to accept responsibility for the problems they created. It's everybody demanding more money. So it's going to be very expensive. And used to, the federal government just threw money at problems like this. I think we're $30 trillion in debt now, staggering debt. We can't just solve this. We no longer have all the surplus water, and we don't have any surplus money. So we actually have, and ultimately, I think it's a political science problem, right? How do we come up with a new collaborative management scheme or structure, political structure, to resolve our differences under conditions of scarcity and extreme duress? And we don't have an answer to that yet.
Dan, I had a question in chat that's on that point. Could you look at that and
Sure, or just if you like, please just repeat it. Right.
Go ahead, Gary.
Would the political fight over allocations doom any rewrite of the 1922 compact? That's the counter argument I hear. There is no way to get to an agreement without cutting agriculture out almost altogether. It's what, 87% of that water use? And that's a politically insurmountable obstacle, I hear. What's your thoughts on
that? Great question. First of all, I have a few pet sayings about water policy, and one of them is everybody becomes a water reformer when you turn on the tap and no water comes out, right? So people say, oh, it's politically insurmountable, we'll never agree to that. Well, when they turn on their tap and no water comes out, they're going to become more reasonable. right? They don't have a choice. You can't just sit in your little corner and pound on your desk and say, we shall take no cuts in our water allocation. Climate change has already made that decision. It's going to be there. So it's going to happen. And there are a few crisis points that are coming up that I think are going to provoke that. One of them is when hydropower stops at Glen Canyon. People are still arguing over, yes, it's important. The hydropower at Glen Canyon could be replaced by solar and power. Most of that goes to cities that have enormous potential for solar. If we had a progressive policy right now, as we begin to lose hydropower in the basin, we should be subsidizing putting solar panels on every house and building in the basin. We're not doing that yet, but they will. And again, they'll say, we'll never do that. Well, when there's no more hydropower, it turns people into reasonable people. We just had a tier 2 shortage call that is forcing draconian cuts in especially Arizona. So Arizona politicians who just a few years ago were saying, we'll never take any of these cuts over my dead body. Right now, they're sitting in their offices figuring out how to do those cuts. So once again, they said, we'll never do this. They're doing it. If Native Americans ever start to actually use their water, if they ever get the funding together to actually divert it and use it, that water, it's a zero-sum situation. That water will have to come out of states and cities' water budgets or from agriculture. That will force those people to become more reasonable. They just don't have a choice. And the other thing, the other dramatic turning point is the minute Utah turns one shovel on the Lake Powell pipeline, the other 6 states are going to sue us and they're going to win. And we have legislators in Utah right now saying, we are absolutely going to build the Lake Powell pipeline. Well, guess what? No, you're not. No, you're not. And here's the other thing that's going to drive some sensibility into people. A lot of people in the upper basin states, and I hear this constantly in Utah. Well, we have 1 million acre feet that we can still use. Or we have 400,000 acre feet of water that we haven't allocated and we're going to take it. Actually, the 22 compact, and you could consider this another deep flaw. Basically, it says what the upper basin gets is met. They get whatever water is available after the lower basin gets its allocation. So the lower basin gets its allocation of 7.5 million acre feet. Mexico gets 1 million or so. We get what's left over. It's potentially possible that the flows could go to 8 or 9 million acre feet. In other words, there's virtually nothing left over. So will we still have politicians in the upper basin saying we must protect the 22 compact when they're getting virtually nothing? I don't think so. So I think a great way to make unreasonable people reasonable is to deprive them of water. And after about 10 minutes, they suddenly become more pliable. And that's exactly what's going to happen. It's unfortunate we have to wait till they're basically hit in the head with this, but that's politics. That's water politics in the Colorado River Basin. So I think it's going to happen. And people say, oh, there's no way we could actually agree on something. Well, we did in 1922. Why can't we agree today?
Wow. Okay, I think we should start questions. Norma Wills, would you ask your question, that one that you wrote into the chat?
Sure. The question is, if Glen Canyon Dam is dismantled, is there sufficient storage in Lake Mead to supply the lower basin states?
Yes, Norma, great question. First of all, the dam will not be dismantled or removed. That's never going to happen. Okay. I know that disappoints my environmentalist friends, but just ain't going to happen. I can't imagine how much money that would cost, and it's just not feasible. So the only real question is, here's the dam in place. It's a big wall. Are we going to drill holes around it to try to pass water? And Lake Mead now is at about, I think it's at 29 or 30%. So there's plenty of capacity in Lake Mead for the lower basin to meet their allocation. The problem we have in the basin today is not capacity, it's inflow. So the real question is not, do we have the reservoir space, but is it going to rain? And the answer to that is not very often. and we just need to be talking about dramatically reduced inflows and living within our water budget. And our water budgets are getting smaller. Right. And that's the great challenge before us today.
And the numbers are getting larger, right?
Yes, the great point. The supply is declining at about the same rate as the demand is increasing. Now, what's amazing about that is that in places like Tucson and Phoenix and especially Las Vegas, they've added millions more in population without a substantial increase in the amount of water they're using. Mm-hmm. So that tells you two things. One, they were wasting a great deal of water. And two, they have some fairly effective water conservation measures. Water conservation will solve some of our problems, but not all of their problems. Agriculture uses somewhere between, now it used to be 80%, now they're saying about 75%. In Utah, I think water conservation is very important. Urban and municipal water use is less than 4% of all the water that's actually diverted and allocated in Utah, 4%. So if all of us went to 20-second showers and only flushed on Thursdays, it's not going to make much difference. It's just not going to, it just won't get us there.
Right.
So agriculture has to be a fundamental part of this solution. And the most radical, demonized idea that I've proposed that really, really no politician would ever touch is, guess what, people? We can't have infinite growth in a finite system. You cannot build subdivisions forever. You cannot have endless population growth in an area of water scarcity. It just can't happen. So we have to start thinking about economies that are not based on building massive new subdivisions and more strip malls and more condos, and a sustainable economy and a sustainable method of living where we're conscious about the water we use. We have a water ethic that values water, and we place a large focus on water justice, meaning that when water gets expensive, it doesn't just go to fill millionaire swimming pools. It has to also go to people who need water, who don't have enough money to pay for expensive water. We need a whole new ethic, a whole new way of thinking. Yeah, those are big changes. They're going to have to take place ethically, morally, culturally, socially, and then they'll happen politically. And scarcity will force this. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Dan, when you talk about politically, are there any bright spots in the future with our Utah legislature, either in the growth or the water issues?
Yes. Part of our problem in the West is the predominant water allocation doctrine is prior appropriation. Prior appropriation says that the people who got here first get their water at times of crisis or shortage, and everybody else gets nothing. Of course, it made sense. We can't fault the people who came here and developed that doctrine because it made perfect sense for them, right? You come out and develop a farm, and then you go to become a state legislator, and you develop the water rights to protect your water allocation to that farm. Perfectly logical thing. That worked great in the last 100 years. It's a recipe for disaster in the next 100 years. And once again, is it Gary? I think Gary asked me the question about politically, how could this happen? For years, the legislature said, we'll never change anything about prior appropriation. It's great. We love it. They just made some incremental changes in prior appropriation to allow for some allocation of water for the Great Salt Lake. It was a small change, but a welcome change, and it shows a shifting attitude there. Now, what's going to happen with the Great Salt Lake, I know we're talking about Lake Powell, but there has to be an earmarked amount of water. There has to be a minimum inflow. That we need to legislate that. And the second thing we need to do is abandon the Bear River project. They could not bring themselves to do either one of those in this past legislative session. I think sometime in the future they will. Those are big steps, and right now they took some welcome small steps, which just a few years ago. Let me give you an example. I was part of the governor's water strategy advisory team. I was talking about how we need a turf buyback program. Turf buybacks have been very successful in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Basically, the municipality says, we'll pay you $25 per square foot of turf grass that we can take out and replace with native landscaping. The attitude just 6 years ago about turf buyback by the water conservancy districts and people in the state division of water resources was, over my dead body, we'll never do that. One of the water conservancy district managers said that turf buyback just means landscapes filled with bones and rattlesnakes. No, skulls and rattlesnakes. That was it, skulls and rattlesnakes. In this past legislative session, that's one of the ideas that's being actively debated. So we went from skulls and rattlesnakes over my dead body to, maybe this is a good idea. And we're seeing something like the beginning of that with Rip Your Strip and some of the proposals to actually incentivize people to remove, especially turf grass, in parking strips. So yes, we saw some a new glimmer of hope that, again, in draconian times when people are looking at really bad situations, and what convinced the legislators, I think this is kind of funny, they took them on a helicopter ride over the Great Salt Lake. Wow, there's a problem here. Really? You don't need a helicopter ride. Just drive by. Just go visit Antelope Island, and you'll see we have a terrible problem. I live in Ogden. On windy days, it's already happening. You can see from our house huge dust plumes developing over the desiccated, the emergent landscape of the Great Salt Lake. And then in the next day or so, our house is covered with this toxic dust. When the houses of state legislators are covered with toxic dust, when their children are in the ERs because they can't breathe and they have lung disease, that's going to change their mind. And if we don't do something about the Great Salt Lake, that is what's going to happen. So it's going to happen. We don't have a choice.
Wow, that's encouraging and discouraging, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But first of all, being an optimist, life is much more fun than being a pessimist. So it's good to be an optimist. And discouragement never results in any change, never creates social justice. Discouragement does not result in progress. So it's the kind of activism that you people are doing that's going to make these changes. If you register people to vote and they vote for people who want to come up with solutions, then we'll get solutions. So we have control over this. We can do this. I'm absolutely convinced we can do this.
And it sounds like you're on committees or commissions that where your voice can be heard too.
Well, that was a temporary
okay.
team that resulted in a report to the governor, and the end result was sort of a compromise where everybody put in their 2 cents worth, and it didn't make any difficult decisions. So it was like a smorgasbord of ideas, many of which are in conflict. For example, the water conservancy districts are adamant that they need a property tax subsidy. I think that's part of the problem. We need to eliminate the property tax subsidy and actually make people pay for water. Yeah. And we should have a steeply tiered water rate. So if you're using a small amount of water, you have a small water bill. Mm-hmm. And if you're using a large amount of water, you have a very, very big water bill. And that works. Other cities have tried that. Tucson has a steeply tiered water structure. And we use something like 260 gallons per person per day in Salt Lake. Tucson's down to around, I think it's 90. Mm. So yes, okay. We can do that. There's lots of tools in the toolbox. We just need political willpower.
Yep, it sounds like we will get it. You'll keep working at your end. The league will work at their end. Good. Before we close up, I have just one announcement. In Saturday, October 8th, is the annual League of Women Voters of Salt Lake annual fete. And it's to honor Catherine Weller, who has been president of the State League and has done so much for Utah with the League of Women Voters. It's a dinner in Salt Lake City at the Town Club. And you can sign up for it by going to the League of Women Voters Salt Lake website, which is lwvsl.org. And I'm going. I think it's going to be a great celebration of the League and everything she's been doing for us. Okay, it is exactly 12 o'clock. Dan, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Yes, claps for you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I very much appreciate the work that the League is doing. It's absolutely essential. Let me just say, in the states where I'm involved in voting rights, it's the League that is always there to encourage people to vote and as an advocate for accessible voting rights. So you're doing great work.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye everybody.
Bye-bye.